Well, howdy there, and welcome to this explainer. Pull up a log by the campfire, greenhorns. Today, we're going to take a real close look at the gritty reality of how we actually survived those months-long cattle drives back between the 1860s and 1890s. Forget what you think you know from the movies, because we're hitting the trail to discover what really fueled the American West.
Now, you see those dashing, dangerous gunslingers Hollywood loves to dream up. Yeah, that's pure myth. The historical reality? We were poorly paid, dirty laborers doing some of the most grueling work you could possibly imagine. Honestly, forget those cinematic shootouts. Our actual daily battle was just surviving the dust, the brutal elements, and the sheer physical exhaustion of moving tens of thousands of unpredictable cattle across hundreds of miles of open country. So to keep us going through all that exhaustion, we needed some serious fuel. Out on the frontier, our grub had to follow 4 incredibly strict rules. It had to be portable, non-perishable, quick to cook, and, most importantly, high calorie. Let me tell you, our diet wasn't glamorous. Nobody was out there plating up gourmet meals for us. It was basically a repetitive, high-calorie engine designed for one thing: keeping us alive, in the saddle, and capable of riding day after endless day. Now, you might be wondering, how in the world did we pull off feeding a hungry crew of cowhands out in the absolute middle of nowhere? Well, absolutely everything in our world revolved around the chuck wagon. This horse-drawn mobile kitchen wasn't just some food cart. It was the undisputed center of the whole camp, and it was run by the absolute most important and often the most temperamental man on the entire trail, the cook, or as we affectionately and very carefully called him, the cookie. And you learned real fast, you just don't mess with the cookie. If you wanted to stay on Cookie's good side, you respected his workspace, and especially his most prized possession, the sourdough starter. Sounds fancy, but it was just a simple, bubbling mix of flour and water. But Cookie guarded this stuff with his life. He kept it warm, he kept it fed, and he used it to bake these sturdy, slightly tangy sourdough biscuits in a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven right over the open campfire flames. Man, those biscuits were the absolute bedrock of our meals. Right alongside those fresh biscuits was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the trail, the pinto bean. Beans were absolutely essential because they hit all 4 of those trail food rules we talked about perfectly. They were easy to store, incredibly easy to transport without spoiling, and you could cook a massive batch in just a single pot. Cookie would slow cook these pinto beans over the fire, toss in a generous chunk of salt pork, and, well, maybe some chilies if we were lucky enough to have them, just to give the pot that rich, savory kick. But here's the thing. Eating beans every single day meant we had to find ways to keep things, entertaining. We ate them so often, we actually had to give them colorful nicknames, like whistleberries and Mexican strawberries. These terms literally became a staple part of our daily trail vocabulary. So if you ever hear an old cowboy wistfully asking for a plate of Mexican strawberries, you know exactly what he means. It's just another bowl of our trusty pinto beans. Of course, we couldn't always rely on a roaring fire for fresh biscuits. When Cookie couldn't bake, we fell back on hardtack. What is it? Well, it's essentially a really dense, dry cracker made from flour and just a tiny bit of water. It was a heavy survival ration that we adopted straight from Civil War soldiers. And let me tell you, this stuff was built to last for months, sometimes even years, without spoiling. Honestly, it was so hard, it would literally break your teeth if you weren't careful. A true test of a cowboy's jaw for sure. Because it was basically a brick, you couldn't just bite into hardtack straight out of the barrel. To actually eat this stuff, you had to soften it up first, just to make it chewable. You could dunk it in your piping hot muddy trail coffee, you could crumble it up to thicken a stew, or, and this was my personal favorite, you could soak it in water and then fry it right up in a pan of sizzling bacon fat. Oh yeah, that was a real game changer for a hungry cowhand. Now, you might think, hey, you're surrounded by tens of thousands of cattle all day. You must be feasting on fresh, juicy steak every night, right? Well, actually, scratch that. We almost never ate fresh beef. Our whole job was to protect the profits, so we only slaughtered an animal if it was injured or sick and couldn't be driven any further. Otherwise, our meat intake relied entirely on preserved proteins. We were constantly chewing on sun-dried, smoked beef jerky, or we relied heavily on chunks of salt pork. And that pork had to be soaked in water before cooking, just to draw out the intense, overwhelming salt. And speaking of pork, let's talk about breakfast. When we said we were eating bacon, it was nothing, and I mean nothing, like your modern thin-sliced, crispy luxury from the supermarket. No way. Our bacon was known as sow belly. It was thick pork fat cut right from the belly, back, or sides of the pig and overwhelmingly cured with salt.
It was heavy, it was incredibly salty, and practically swimming in grease. But you know what? That dense calorie load is exactly what kept our blood pumping and our bodies moving through the freezing morning dust. So our days really had a distinct rhythm when it came to eating. Back at camp, safely by the fire, we'd get hot, heavy bowls of beans, fresh sourdough biscuits, and rich stews. But when we were up in the saddle, actively working the herd, we survived purely on dry rations. We just gnawed on tough beef jerky or snagged a handful of dried fruit to keep our energy up, all without ever stopping the drive.
Which brings us to produce. Now, you can't just eat sow belly and hardtack for months on end without getting terribly, terribly sick. So, to fight off illnesses like scurvy, and honestly just to add a little bit of sweetness to a very savory, salty existence, Cookie kept a stash of durable vegetables and dried fruits. We throw hearty potatoes and onions right into our stews for texture, and for essential vitamins, we relied heavily on dried apples, apricots, peaches, raisins, and prunes. Finding fresh fruit on the trail was basically a miracle, so those dried fruits, absolute lifesavers. Now, if you were riding with a well-funded outfit and your chuck wagon was particularly well-stocked, you might get to experience the closest thing we had to pure magic out on the plains. We lovingly referred to them as airtights. That was our cowboy slang for heavy, expensive, commercially canned goods. They were a massive luxury, and I'll tell you, Cookie guarded his small stash of airtights almost as fiercely as he guarded that sourdough starter. Those airtights were incredibly prized, particularly the canned tomatoes. And they weren't just a tasty addition to a stew either. You see, the untreated river water we had to drink out on the trail was often laced with nasty, bitter gypsum. Stuff would absolutely tear your stomach to pieces. But the high acidity and the much-needed sugar in a can of tomatoes literally acted as a remedy. It settled our stomachs, quenched our incredible thirst, and neutralized the harsh effects of that bad water. Seriously, they were practically medicine in a tin.
But tomatoes aside, there was one can that stood above all the rest. If the Cookie cracked open a can of peaches, man, it was the ultimate morale booster. Let me paint the picture for you here. You've been riding for 12 straight hours, you're completely covered in sweat and trail dust, your bones are aching, and then you get a taste of syrupy, sweet, canned peaches. It was the absolute peak of luxury on a harsh, unforgiving frontier. It reminded you that there was actually still a civilized world out there somewhere, far beyond the herd.
So we've stripped away the Hollywood glamour in this explainer. We've laid out the beans, the hardtack, the sow belly, and the precious canned peaches. Having seen the unglamorous, dust-choked reality of our daily rations and the immense physical toll of the drive, I gotta leave you greenhorns with this final thought. Sure, the cowboy life looks incredibly romantic up on the silver screen, but looking at this menu, do you really have the grit and the stomach to survive the real cowboy diet? Something to think about next time you fry up your morning bacon. Keep exploring, greenhorns.